We stay in the season that we are in. This means moving towards the fall season and the fall feasts, beginning of course with Yom Teruah, better known as Rosh Hashanah, followed 10 days later by Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And but the message today is maybe unexpected in this light. It's from Zechariah, or Zachariah in Hebrew, and I've often called this book, Zechariah, the book of Revelation of the Old Testament. It's very much related to the book of Revelation that we have in the New Testament. It uses many of the same themes, and it has the same sequence. You find the four horses of the apocalypse, you find the two witnesses, the rebuilding of the temple, the second coming. All these things are in there, and so it's very interesting to put this next to each other. But since it's in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible or in our Old Testament, it is at the same time maybe more focused on Israel, on the remnant of the Jewish people. And then you can ask yourself, why is it relevant to us? Well, it is because we see that God's plan with Israel and God's plan with the Gentiles, it converges towards the time of the end. It comes together. So when we look at what's happening in Israel, when we look at what's happening with the remnant of God's people, we can also see where we are, and we see it's all getting closer to each other. And in the Bible, of course, we see, in the New Testament, we see it come to fruition in Revelation 12, where the remnant of Israel recognizes Yeshua as the Messiah, Jesus as the Messiah, and which is a mid-trib event in the middle of the 7 years. And then in Revelation 19, when Jesus returns, there is this full redemption coming for Israel, which is also in Zechariah chapter 12, and that's at the end of the 7 years. And it's my strong belief that this mid-trib events happen at and around Pesach, and the return of Jesus and the redemption of Israel at Yom Kippur. And from there, of course, you can calculate when other events happen. And this is actually perfectly foretold in Genesis chapter 29, where we see Jacob, being Israel, who has his eye on Rachel. And Rachel is a type of the Jewish people. After that he labors for her, he doesn't get Rachel, he gets Leah, which is a type of the Gentile church. So we see exactly what happened with Jesus. He came, he preached in the synagogues, he came for the lost children of Israel, but they rejected him, and instead it were the Gentiles that accepted him as Messiah. And it is only after 7 years of extra labor that Jacob did that he got Rachel as his bride, and these 7 years of extra labor are the 70-year tribulation period, after which the remnant of the Jewish people will be added to the church. So this is a very interesting parallel that we see there, and that's why Jeremiah calls it Jacob's trouble. It was literally in Genesis 29 Jacob's trouble. He was troubling, he didn't get Rachel, whom he fell in love with, and he had to labor, to go through trouble for an extra 7 years. So when we look at the feast, Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, it's a call, and it's the home calling. It actually points to the rapture, and that is the final redemption of the church, and that is paralleled by Leah. And then you have Yom Kippur, which is the final redemption of Israel, coinciding with the second coming of Jesus, and that is typified by Rachel. And you see between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur are 7 days. Between the rapture and the second coming are 7 years. Between Jacob getting Leah as bride and getting Rachel as bride, there are 7 years. So there's a perfect parallel there. So this just as introduction, and let's go back to Zechariah, because as you will see, this has everything to do with this theme as well. And I want to read from chapter 3. I will read the whole chapter. It's not so long. Zechariah 3. And he shewed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. And the Lord said unto Satan, The Lord rebuke thee, O Satan, even the Lord that has chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and stood before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment. And I said, Let them set a fair mitre upon his head. And so they set a fair mitre upon his head, and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord stood by. And the angel of the Lord protested unto Joshua, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, If thou wilt walk in my ways, and if thou wilt keep my charge, then thou shalt also judge my house, and thou shalt also keep my courts, and I will give thee places to walk among these that stand by. Hear now, O Joshua, the high priest, thou and thy followers that sit before thee, for they are men wondered at. For behold, I will bring forth my servant, the branch. For behold, the stone that I have laid before Joshua, upon the stone shall be 7 eyes. Behold, I will engrave the graving thereof, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in 1 day. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, shall you carry every man his neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree. So you read this, and maybe then you just shrug your shoulders, what does all this mean, and you move on. But this chapter is actually so beautiful if you really study it, and of course by the help of the Holy Spirit to understand. It gives us an inside look, you can say, of what's happening at the Heavenly Tribunal, or even what's happening at the Day of Atonement when the High Priest enters the Holy of Holies. Because this actually describes a future fulfillment of the Day of Atonement. It is written after the Israelites have returned from Babylon, and they are still carnal. They have not learned much. They're still carnal, and very much as they are today. Not much has changed, unfortunately. And so we see here the same elements and the same sequence of the events that happen on the Day of Atonement as they are described in Leviticus 16. And so we're not going to read Leviticus 16, but you can check that for yourself. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest has to be cleansed first, so he will bring an offering and do some rituals and change his garment to be clean before he is able to enter the Holy of Holies. That is in Leviticus 4, this changing of garment, and we just read it here also in verse 4 and 5. And once he is inside, he atones for the nation. That is actually the purpose of the Day of Atonement, to every year atone again for the nation. And that is in Leviticus 16 verse 17, and here it is in verse 9. We read there at the end of verse 9, I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. It's speaking about the nation. And in Leviticus 16 it is clear that it speaks there about Yom Kippur, about the Day of Atonement. That is made clear in the end of the chapter, verse 29-31. Here you cannot see it so clearly, but there is a hint in the verse preceding this chapter, the last verse of chapter 2. And of course, originally there were no chapters or verses, so there was just one flow of text. But the last verse of chapter 2 says, Be silent, all flesh, before the Lord, for he is raised up out of his holy habitation. The Lord is raised up out of his holy habitation. He comes out of his holy of holies, of his holy place. That is what the high priest did after the atonement was completed. He would come out of the Holy of Holies. That was what the people were waiting for and hoping for, that indeed he would come out alive. Because that meant that their sins for the nation, their corporate sins were atoned for. And that is why this also points to the second coming of Jesus. When Jesus ascended to heaven, he went as the high priest. Hebrews 5 verse 5 says he is our high priest. He went as the high priest into the Holy of Holies, and there he's mediating until he returns. And he returns out of the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. And that is what this is all about. Now there is one thing missing. If you compare Leviticus 16 with Zechariah 3, there's one thing missing in the whole story. Leviticus 16 speaks abundantly about animal sacrifices, the sprinkling of blood, and here you find none of this. And that is because here there is another means of atonement. This speaks about the true atonement. This is after Jesus has done his work. He is the one that provides, and he is mentioned here in verse 8 as the branch or the sprout. Now, if we look what's happening here, we see that Joshua, he was the high priest at that time, he stands before the angel of the Lord. So you have to really picture this as Joshua the high priest doing everything that's written in Leviticus 16, and then he enters through the veil into the Holy of Holies. And then something happens in the spiritual realm, and that's what we read here. He stands basically before the angel of the Lord, and Satan is standing at his right hand. It says here in King James to resist him. Other translations would say to accuse him. That's actually maybe better translation in this context. So why was Satan standing at Joshua's right hand? Well, for this purpose, to accuse him. In a criminal court in those days, the accuser would always be on the right hand of the one being accused. And the right hand side is always the side where there's the authority. So the accuser, he was always ahead because he had something to blame the other and to accuse the other. He was standing at the right hand. So you see, this is the picture of a court, a tribunal, where there is the angel of the Lord, as it says, and then Joshua, he is the one who is found guilty, or at least he's accused, and there's the accuser at the right hand. And so what is going to happen now? Well, what we see, of course, Joshua is guilty. He is guilty. And it says in verse 3, now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments. This is a type, it's not literal, but it's type that he was guilty. Filthy garments means clothed in sin. And that is why you see in Leviticus 16 that the priest had to atone for himself, first by sacrificing the bullock and sprinkling blood and all this, but he also had to change his garments. He had to put on a different garment. That one day in a year the high priest would be clothed all in white. Whereas in the other years, when we went through this, when we studied the priestly clothing, especially the high priest, he had more color in his garments, but not on the Day of Atonement. He would be dressed in white. And that is a type that he would be clean. But in spite of all that, in spite of the animal sacrifice, in spite of the garments, when he was standing before the throne of God, he was guilty. He had filthy garments, actually, in the eyes of God. He was guilty. And this is for all of us. Each one of us will one day stand before the tribunal, the Heavenly Tribunal. And each one of us will be dressed in filthy garments. But fortunately, it doesn't end there. Now, the high priest here, he represents the nation. He was the one to go inside the Holy of Holies, which was, to say it popularly, it was a tricky thing to do. He might not come out alive. He had to take all kinds of precautions and make sure there was enough smoke so that he would not see too much. And it was very risky. And if God would not be pleased, he would die there. And that was it. And the sins of the nations would not be atoned for. So he represents the nation. And there you see also why God was so angry when the Israelites made the golden calf while Moses was on the mountain. Because it was the high priest, Aaron at the time, who was personally involved in this sin. He was the one to represent the nation before God. And he was personally involved in this sin. And there was, of course, an abomination. So, we have the high priest here in filthy garments. But what happens? He receives fine robes. And what do they signify? They signify the righteousness of God. You can find this in in Revelation chapter 19, verse 8, where it says about the bride, and to her it was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. For the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. So that is what we as a bride of Christ will receive in heaven. The same that we read here about Joshua the high priest. New, fine or white raiment. It's the righteousness of God. So how does this happen? We have to recognize something here in this chapter, and I did not get it at first, but once you see this, it becomes so much more clear what's happening here. And it also maybe sheds a new light on the old covenant. It says in verse 1, Zechariah 3, Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord. Who is the angel of the Lord? Who is this? That's the question. You can, certainly from the King James that I have here, you cannot get it. But think of this, that the angel of the Lord is the angel of righteousness. It's actually Jesus himself. He is the angel of the Lord. Now, if the translators of the King James would have recognized that, they would have capitalized angel. This is what they do consistently. For example, in verse 8 with the branch, it's capitalized. But they didn't do it with angel of the Lord, so apparently they did not recognize that, or they were not in agreement about this, the team of translators. But this is Jesus. Now it becomes more clear. He showed in Joshua the high priest standing before Jesus, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. Now, think again of a tribunal. What happens when you're in court? You have, of course, the judge, but then you are there, and let's say you are accused of something. You are there, and you have, at one side, you have the party or the person that accuses you, and on the other side, there's your lawyer, who will try to defend you. And that's what's happening here. Joshua has on one side, he has Satan, the accuser, but he is standing before Jesus, the angel of the covenant. It's not an angel in the sense of an angelic being. If we think of the word angel in Hebrew, it means messenger. He was the messenger of the Lord. He is the spokesperson, you can say. So he stood before Jesus, and then in verse 3, you see, now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and stood before Jesus, before the angel. And he, that's Jesus, the angel here, and he, Jesus, answered and spake to those that stood before him. These are the other angels. Jesus commands the other angels present there saying, "Take away the filthy garments from him." And then he said to him, dus Jesus said to Joshua, "Behold, I, Jesus, have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I, Jesus, will clothe thee with change of raiment." And this is completely in line with what we read in the New Testament. It is Jesus who takes away the sin from us, and it is Jesus who clothes us in white raiment, so that we can appear clean and righteous before God. And that is exactly what we just read also in Revelation 19. It is Jesus who rebuked Satan. And why did he do so? Not because the claims of Satan were false, they were right. Because it says Joshua was clothed in filthy garments. He was full of sin, like all of us. So Satan's claims, when we stand before the throne of God, his claims are right. He accuses us and he's right. But it doesn't end there, because Jesus had annulled these accusations. And he makes it clear by changing the raiments. He says even in verse 2 to Satan, "Is not this a brand," that's a branch, or a branch plucked out of the fire? In the complete Jewish Bible it says, "Isn't this man a burning stick snatched from the fire?" And that is really how we are. We are so full of sin, we are already burning. But he snatches us out of the fire, and he saves us. That is what happens. And if he wouldn't do that, we would just be consumed by the fire. And Satan, of course, that's what Satan wants. So we see here perfectly what Jesus does, how his atoning work works. How it works in the Heavenly Tribunal. He is literally our Vindicator, who saves us from these accusations and sets us free. He is our advocate. And after this, so rebuking Satan, he commands his own angels to change the garments. And then Satan cannot say anything anymore, because there's no blemish visible anymore. It's been atoned. It's very interesting to see this in the light of the Old Covenant. It is here the high priest on the Day of Atonement that enters the Holy of Holies. And if we read Leviticus, if we read the Torah, we see that it's all about animal sacrifices and rituals and all these things. But when we see what's happening at the spiritual level, which is, we get a glance here, we see actually there is not much difference with what happens in the New Covenant. It's Jesus who atones. It's Jesus who, in his grace, takes away the sin and atones. God is actually consistent in how he works throughout the ages. And if it was not for Jesus' atoning work, none would be saved, also not before his work on the cross. Now, verse 8 or 9, I think it is, we said already, "I will remove the iniquity of the land." Now, so he atones for the nation. And this will be ultimately fulfilled when Jesus returns. In Zechariah chapter 12, it says that the house of David will be restored. It's also in Hosea 6, the beginning verses, where it says also this: in the third day, referring to the third period of 1,000 years after Jesus' first advent, which is the millennial. In that day, the house of David will be restored, and they will dwell with him. And so we see in verse 8, here in Zechariah 3, that it happens because of the branch, my servant, the branch. And the branch, or the sprout, refers to Jesus. It is a clear hint here, in case we would not understand what is meant. And just to see a few verses where that corroborate with this, the Hebrew wording is consistently used by different prophets. For example, Isaiah in chapter 4, verse 2, There it says, "In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel." So here we see the branch of the Lord. And by the way, the context of this verse is the millennial. The first verse here of chapter 4 speaks about the 7 women. These are the 7 churches. That's Revelation chapter 2 and 3, the 7 churches, the church age, the 2,000 years from Jesus' first advent until the rapture, the beginning of the tribulation period. And then in verse 2 it speaks about the millennial that follows after that. It speaks about those that are escaped of Israel. This is the remnant. So we see also the same context. And in Isaiah 11, verse 1 and 2, it says, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, the father of David, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom, understanding, of counsel, and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord." We see again the branch, and then it speaks about the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. And then it mentions, we looked at this also when we studied the book of Revelation, it mentions 7 characteristics of the Spirit of the Lord. And we find it also in Zechariah 3, the stone with the 7 eyes. This means that this rock, the Spirit of the Lord rests upon it. And then Jeremiah, he uses the same phraseology in Jeremiah 23, verse 5. "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth." And again, context here is the millennial, the restoration of the house of David. Jeremiah 33, verse 15, almost the same words. "In those days and at that time I will cause the branch of righteousness to grow up unto David, and he shall execute judgment and righteousness in the land." The branch. And even back to Zechariah in Zechariah 6, verse 12, we see also the same. "And speak unto him, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold, the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord." The branch, it refers to the Messiah, to Jesus. And his atonement applies to all of us individually, but also to Israel, the restoration, the final redemption of Israel corporately. Again, in verse 9 of chapter 3, I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. So with his sacrifice, Jesus provided the means of the cleansing. And that's why we don't see animal sacrifice mentioned here, although we have all the other attributes of the Day of Atonement. Again, the ascension, Jesus went into the Holy of Holies, and with his return, the Day of Atonement, he will come out. And it follows exact pattern of what the priest would do. We see actually in Jesus' actions different patterns. We looked at, of course, how he is the groom, and how all these events follow the pattern of the wedding, and this is especially applies to the church, the bride of Christ. So we see that when he had the Last Supper, that is the cup of betrothal, the engagement, and he says, I will not drink with you from this cup until that day in my Father's house, which we see fulfilled in Revelation 19, the wedding of the marriage of the bride and the lamb. So the ascension is part of that, the departure of the groom, Pentecost or Shavuot is part of that, the decoration of the bride. All these things follow the exact pattern, but we see also the pattern of him being the high priest. And then the Last Supper is actually what the high priest also would do. This cup to confirm the covenant. You see the sacrifice following, and you see that he has to go into the Holy of Holies, and he will come out after that. So these patterns are beautiful if you recognize them. So we know from the book of Revelation that the return of Jesus begins the millennial reign, and that is in chapter 20 of the book of Revelation. And when before that happens, so Jesus reigns for 1,000 years on the earth. It's a day of rest on the earth after 6,000 years of strife, as the Lord calls it in Genesis 6. Now there is rest. And so that's the seventh day, the day of the Lord. But it says in the beginning of this chapter 20 of the book of Revelation, I saw an angel come down from heaven having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. So before the 1,000 years begin, Satan is bound. That is the only way that there can be peace. We see the same in Zechariah 3. It begins with the Lord rebuking Satan. He binds, so to speak, the accusations that Satan brings. He annuls them. He cancels them. And after that, he can do the atonement. The rebuking of Satan in Zechariah 3 does not change anything to the state of Joshua. He's still in filthy garments. And it's the same with us. We cannot point our finger at Satan and say, he's the cause, I cannot do anything, and God takes care of Satan and we are okay. No, actually, of our sins is in our hearts. And it's the same also in the millennium. We will see that the nature of men hasn't changed by Satan being bound, and we see that they will sin again. And they will actually rebel again against Jesus. So that's why after Satan has been bound, then the clothing of Joshua has to be changed. Accusations, they are just. When we stand before the Heavenly Tribunal, the accusations against us, they are just. And without a vindicator, we are doomed. We're lost. We will be verdicted, and the punishment is death. The wages of sin is death. So with removing the accuser, the legal debt is not removed. Only through Jesus' work, which is the atonement. Only through Jesus' work we can be atoned. This is how I should say it. It is a satisfaction of the legal debt, if you talk in legal terms. It's very similar when you are in court, when the accuser sits down and he stops talking, you're still guilty. You still have to have some sort of defense. The legal debt is not satisfied. And so that's where your lawyer steps in, and he begins now his plea. And in the case of Jesus, it's very simple. He removes all sin. And that's sufficient, and it is permanent. And in Zechariah 3 we find that this idea of being permanent, that it is being sealed with a stone of remembrance. This is typically something, we don't know this, but it is in ancient traditions, this is what often happened. A stone was placed somewhere as a place of remembrance. We see in the Old Testament several places where the patriarchs also place stones at places where they met the Lord, for example. And it's still very much a Jewish tradition if you get the chance to go to a Jewish cemetery, you will often see on the tombstones little pebbles on top of it. It means someone visited that grave, and as a remembrance he left a stone there. So usually you just don't touch those. But this is a stone of remembrance, and we see it here also in verse 9. Behold, the stone that I have laid before Joshua. He put a stone of remembrance to seal this. This is permanent. And in that it is different from the Day of Atonement that we find in the Torah. They were not permanent. They had to be repeated every year. And in between, on a daily basis, they had to bring sacrifices. So it was not at all permanent, but this one is. That's why we can see that this points to the final redemption, this final Day of Atonement. We see the same also in Revelation 2, verse 17. It applies just the same to the church, to us, Christians. Revelation 2, verse 17. It says, He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. To him that overcometh I will give to eat of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone. And in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth, saving he that receiveth it. A stone of remembrance, to make it permanent. It's a symbol, of course, but it shows something. It's engraved. It's engraved here in Revelation 2, but also here in Zechariah 3, it says the same. It is, I will engrave the graving thereof. He makes it permanent. So in this whole story we see a wonderful demonstration of Jesus as our advocate and vindicator before the Heavenly Tribunal. And this is really very comforting, because when we look in a mirror, not literally but spiritually, and the mirror actually is this, the Word of God. When we look in the mirror we see what we just read about Joshua, that we are clothed in filthy clothes. And even if we would do all the things that the high priest would do, the sacrificing, the sprinkling of blood, the putting on new garments, if we look in the spiritual mirror, we still clothed in filthy garments. Satan can just point at us and mention a list of things, and we can only say, yeah, I'm guilty of this. But this wonderful comfort and blessed hope we have, Jesus has died for these sins. His sacrifice was once and for all to atone for this. And it annuls all the accusations that Satan can bring against us. And when we stand before the throne of God, we are dressed in fine white garments, the garments of righteousness, white and clean. It can only be through Jesus. And at the same time, this story is a foreshadow of the final redemption of Israel on this great Day of Atonement, as they call it. I will mention this probably in a few weeks when the feast is going, but it's day Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, but in Hebrew they usually call it Yom Kippurim, plural. So Day of Atonements, because they speak about the personal atonement, but they also speak of the final redemption of the nation. That is what they look forward to, and they hope that it comes soon, and actually they expect it soon. So we find both these threads in this story. It's a wonderful story that gives us insight of the spiritual side of what happens on the Day of Atonement, and what happens anytime we go on our knees and bring all our sins before the Lord and accept His blood to cover that. So with Paul I would like to say, let's comfort one another with these words. Amen.